All right, guys, we're now at cluster C for this module of all the different personality disorders. I told you earlier in one of the other videos, this is a section when we talk about the personality disorders where there's a lot of information. And I don't want to overload you, but there's lots and lots of good stuff in this module because there's lots of good stuff with the different personality disorders. So again, make sure you go and look at those lecture notes, look at the handouts I've given to you for each of these three clusters. And we are talking in this video about cluster C. There are three remaining personality disorders. We already talked about 7. We have the 3 remaining: avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. These all belong to cluster C. And this is a cluster where all the personality traits tend to be overly anxious or fearful. So you may remember with cluster A, with paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal, I kind of referenced schizophrenia several times with cluster A, that in a way those 3 cluster A personality disorders are kind of schizophrenia-like. Well, these 3 in cluster C are kind of anxiety disorder related, like they're kind of anxiety-like. And so we've already covered the anxiety disorders: generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, specific phobia, OCD, PTSD, panic disorder. All of those, we've already covered all those. Well, in some ways, these 3 personality disorders are kind of like an advanced version of some of those. For example, this first one, avoidant personality disorder, to me, is sort of like an advanced version of social anxiety disorder. So social anxiety disorder is that anxiety phobia, social phobia, anxiety disorder, where a person really is leery and fearful of social situations and performance situations, especially people that I don't know. Imagine if you multiplied typical social anxiety disorder times 3. So typical social anxiety disorder times 3, right, would be avoidant personality disorder. This is a personality disorder, again, a lifestyle, a chronic lifestyle, chronic presentation where people are persistently and overwhelmingly just afraid of being viewed by others as inadequate or negatively. So it's kind of like social anxiety disorder. This is really an insecure person who is overly fixated and is stressed, almost like beyond anxiety, just sort of has this firm belief that people are going to reject them, that they don't measure up, they avoid social situations. They're convinced that people are going to not harm them, like with paranoid, but that people are going to reject them. There's this discomfort. There's this avoidance of, as the name implies, relationships, because they are convinced in their mind. They believe it as if it was almost like a delusion in a way. They are convinced that they do not measure up, and that people, when they see the real them, are going to reject them and are going to hate them and not like them. As a result, they avoid, obviously, social conversations, social relationships, work relationships, family relationships. In a lot of ways, people with this personality disorder initially are probably diagnosed with social anxiety disorder because it kind of looks like that at first. But again, the longer you get, the closer you get to a person with this personality disorder, you realize, something more going on here. This is not just like your typical social anxiety. This is like a belief system. This is like an ingrained belief system that a person has that is not healthy and is just not right. They get kind of over focused on being accepted, over focused on being rejected, and they believe that they are fundamentally flawed in many, many ways. And so, therefore, they just they are nervous about, they are avoidant of personal relationships. In some ways, this personality disorder is kind of similar in some ways to borderline in this way. With borderline personality disorder, the person again has a really like a lack of sense of self, like no self identity. In this personality disorder, avoidant, the person has a self identity that is hated. Does that make sense? So with borderline personality disorder, a person like lacks a self image. They don't know who they are. With avoidant personality disorder, this person knows who they are. They hate themselves. That's kind of what avoidant personality disorder is. So to me, this is kind of a cousin to an advanced version of social anxiety disorder. That's how I always kind of keep avoidant personality disorder kind of clear in my mind. As I think about like an advanced kind of version of social anxiety disorder. People are with this personality disorder are intensely shy. They isolate themselves. They may be drawn For example, they usually have real strong, vivid imaginations. They may have like a fantasy world that they engage in, where they're a strong person, where they're a competent person. A person with the features of this personality disorder may be drawn to comic books and fantasy play and video games and that kind of thing. Now, again, lots of people are drawn to those kind of things. That doesn't mean that because someone likes comic books or someone likes fantasy video games or whatever, that means that they have avoidant personality disorder. Not at all. But people with this personality disorder are oftentimes drawn to that. So avoidant personality disorder, kind of like social anxiety disorder in a way. I think it kind of makes sense. Then there's dependent personality disorder. So dependent personality disorder is kind of like the opposite of avoidant personality disorder. This is a person, maybe someone who is overly dependent upon other people. They cannot and will not make a decision. They act as if they cannot care for themselves. And they oftentimes find themselves in relationships where they are the dependent one. They are not the dominant one, they are the dependent one. And we see this in men and in women where people have this chronic pattern of, I don't know what to do. I can't do anything. And again, it's not for attention, and it's not because they're lazy. It's because it is a part of who they are. They are so terrified of making their own decision, they let other people make decisions for them. They have this overwhelming fear of being separated from those who are their caretakers, sort of like separation anxiety disorder with kids a little bit in a way. It's like the adult version kind of that. They're overly submissive, overly clingy in relationships. They struggle with everyday kinds of decisions. Again, kind of like we talked about with depression, when people battle major depressive disorder. You may remember we talked about that. People oftentimes are indecisive. This is kind of beyond that. This is just someone who almost acts as if they don't know how. They act as if they never have made a decision for themselves, and they are overly dependent upon other people. They don't speak up and express disagreements because they're fearful, kind of like avoid. They're fearful of rejection in a way, a little bit different here, though. They struggle with independent tasks. No, well, you tell me what to do. I don't know where to start. You show me. I mean, because so this is someone who's like a grown adult and acts like they don't know how to do anything, and they've kind of become accustomed to, and they kind of make themselves depend on other people having to do everything kind of for them. So we see a lot of that. Difficult being by themselves, and if someone leaves them or rejects them, they're going to be sad and devastated, but they're going to immediately look for someone else who'll take them in. Does that make sense? I'm thinking of clients I've worked with before. I'm thinking of one client in particular, a lady who I worked with many, many years ago, who had many features of this personality disorder. And she was very, 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 very dependent, very, very, very submissive. And the guy that she was with got tired of her, and he left her, and she was devastated. And, I remember talking to her when she was devastated. It took her about 2 weeks. She found another guy. And it was the same deal. She found another guy who was going to be dominant and controlling, and she was totally happy with that. Didn't take her long. She found another guy. And she got over this other guy real quick and found another guy to take care of her. And so maybe men and women sometimes can struggle with this in many, many ways. Unfortunately, one of the patterns we see, I mentioned this in your lecture notes, one of the patterns we see with dependent personality disorder, unfortunately, is that men and women with the features of this personality disorder will put up with a lot of stuff in relationships that they shouldn't. They will allow themselves to be victimized physically or sexually, oftentimes in domestic violence situations. Not always, but often what you have is a dominant, predominant man or a woman who has a submissive, overly dependent, and unhealthily submissive husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner, and that person will not leave. The person who is being abused will not leave because it's not because they're afraid to. They just cannot. They allow themselves to stay because they are so dependent in an unhealthy way on another person. We also see sometimes, unfortunately, the dependent personality disorder person is attracted to the antisocial person. So imagine a man who has antisocial personality disorder or narcissism. He's going to be attracted maybe to a woman who has dependent features because they kind of go together. And so what happens then, and I've had personal experience with this, you may have a person with dependent personality disorder who kind of falls in with a guy who engages in illegal behavior, and he uses her. The example I'm using, it was a man and a woman. My client was the woman, and she had gotten in trouble with the law because she just went along with her husband. I mean, so he was engaged in illegal activity. She was not going to stand up to him, and then he kind of manipulated her and got her involved to where now she's engaging in illegal activity. And the only reason she did is there was no way she was not going to, because she just was not going to leave this guy. And so he kind of manipulated her and got her, and suddenly now she's in trouble with the law because I mean she does not have any social features. She knows it's wrong. She feels bad about it, but she kind of goes along with this guy because he's engaged in illegal activity. So he says, "Hey, drive my car and drive me by this house over here while I shoot it up." And she goes, "Okay." Right? She knows it's wrong, but she drives him. The example I'm using. So she drives him while he goes and shoots up a house, and she just goes along, and so we see patterns of that as well too with dependent personality disorder. So avoidant personality disorder, and then dependent. And here's the last one: obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is an interesting one. This is our last one. This is number 10. Now here's a confusing thing about OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. You may remember OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, that disorder that is an anxiety related disorder, which is characterized by obsessions and compulsions. This is not obsessive compulsive personality disorder, is not OCD. It is not an anxiety disorder. It shares some features, but what obsessive compulsive personality disorder is the extreme unhealthy perfectionist. This is the overly rigid, overly controlling, only can see the black and white rules of life. This is an overly controlling, perfectionistic person who is consumed with orderliness, with rules, and that kind of thing. Now, again, that sounds like OCD. Here's the key thing: people with obsessive compulsive personality disorder aren't anxious, they're controlling. Another way of saying it is they're not anxious, they're angry. Because with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, they're going to force you to abide by their rules. If I have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is an anxiety disorder, I may have my bathroom ritual every morning that I go through as I wash my clothes and wash my hair and take a shower and get dressed. I may have all my rituals, but I don't make my wife engage in those rituals when she gets dressed. It's my deal. That's OCD. If I have obsessive compulsive personality disorder, then I'm going to be checking my wife's closet before I leave for work. I'm going to make her come in there. I try to make her come in there and clean it up if I have to. And not only does my bathroom have to be clean, your bathroom has to be clean. And not only does my area have to be clean, I'm going to force you. I have all these rigid rules. Sort of looks like OCD a little, but it's more controlling. So the person with OCD is anxious. The person with OCPD is controlling. So all these black and white kind of rules, almost like the Marine drill instructor gone wrong, right? All these rules about life, all these rules about my world, and what I do is I try to control everybody and everything. And so this obsessive compulsive personality kind of disorder. This is a person who is just totally inflexible, rigid. If you have them on your team, if they're on your group in your class, if you're doing a group presentation in class, if you work with them at work, you can't get anything done because they are so fixated on the rules. It has to be done a certain way. And no, we're not good. No, I can't. It's almost like an inability to be flexible, an inability to negotiate. No, I'm going to do it by myself. Many years ago, I was teaching a class here at the college, and I was doing a group presentation. I did some group presentations in that class, and I had a lady who I'd had before in my classes. She was in that class. I figured she was going to struggle. And after a couple of days of meeting with her group, she came to me in private and asked me if she could do a solo project. And I said, I don't think so. Why? And she said, I cannot work with these people. I cannot work with these people. And I said, well, what's going on? And she started describing for me her own rigidity. Everything she described for me was not a big deal to me. I cannot work with these people. Well, why not? Well, because they're not gonna. In other words, I'm not in control. They're not going to do what I want, so therefore, no, there's no way. And there was and again, it wasn't anxiety; it was almost like anger. You could hear it in her voice as she talked to me. There was almost like this seething anger that I will not work with these people. Just real overly rigid, and obsessive compulsive, perfectionistic. Someone who will not delegate authority, someone who's anxious when they have to work with others. Someone who has these real unhealthy high standards, for themselves and the world, and just real obsessive compulsive in that in with regard to other people. So again, it's important to keep OCPD, this personality disorder, separate from OCD. With obsessive compulsive disorder, the key thing again with OCD is if I have OCD and I have a bathroom ritual and a shower ritual every morning, well, then I'm going to engage in that. I don't care what my wife is doing. I don't care what she's doing. But if I have OCPD, I'm going to try to force her and my kids and everyone in my house has to abide by my rules. And they're going to be real rigid rules. And if you don't, there's going to be trouble or problems, right? So this is real rigid, anxious, not anxious, but more angry, controlling kind of a person, right? So OCPD is like perfectionism, excessive, unhealthy, inappropriate, lack of insight, perfectionism. The person with OCPD oftentimes sees their high standards as a badge of honor. They don't see what we see in them. They don't see how unrealistic it is. For them, they feel very superior in a lot of ways, kind of narcissistic a little bit. They feel very superior, that they are a person with such high standards. And the problem is not me, the problem is you, right? Which is the typical hallmark of most personality disorders. The problem is not me, the problem is you. And so a lot of times with OCPD, they're difficult to sort of deal with in relationships because they believe that their high standards is part of what makes them a great person. And the fact that you cannot or will not attain their level of high standards makes you a terrible person, right? So obsessive compulsive personality disorder, this idea of this excessive perfectionism, the person who is angry and controlling as opposed to anxious. So that's cluster C: avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. I've now said this a couple times. Make sure you look in the module, get the lecture notes, get the little cheat sheets for all three of the little clusters, and come back next time for our next module. We'll be talking about our last module, eating disorders. I have a great time. I'll see you then.